In this video, we will take a brief look at social movements, understanding what they are and how they differ from other types of collective action, like interest groups. When we're talking about social movements, we're referring to a somewhat nebulous concept. There's no hard and fast dividing line between what is and what is not a social movement, but there are some things that we can say in general about what makes a social movement. First, social movements consist of a complex set of collective campaigns and events oriented toward a social change goal. So this means that a social movement involves some coordinated actions over time to try to effect some change in society. Secondly, social movements tend to have affiliated organizations that provide structure, or a glue, if you will, to the social movement. But the boundaries of movements are quite loose. This means that movements include people who are active members in organizations, but it also includes regular folks who aren't formally affiliated with any organization, but still consider themselves to be part of a cause and can sometimes be called upon to participate in direct actions like protest rallies and marches. Let's get a deeper understanding of social movements by contrasting them with interest groups. Social movements tend to make greater use of outside political tactics, things like protests or boycotts. These are activities that are not part of the regular institutional processes of government. Social movements engage in these outside tactics because they're generally trying to achieve some broader change in society, beyond just changes in governmental policy. For instance, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was about changing race relations in the country, not just laws regarding race. It was about achieving equal status in society for African Americans. Laws like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were important policy changes that resulted because of the civil rights movement, but those laws were not the main purpose of the movement. The example of the civil rights movement also highlights the fact that social movements often, although not always, focus on issues of identity or morality. Race, religion, oppression of all kinds, these have been the sorts of things that have tended to give animating life to social movements. Social movements emphasize direct action by supporters, taking to the streets or other forms of direct action in which people take a clear stand on behalf of the movement's goals. Social movements tend to be skeptical of government deal-making. Social movements often arise because groups of people feel shut out of the traditional political process. This presents something of a dilemma for social movements because once they become successful enough to gain the attention of policymakers, they're often faced with difficult decisions about whether and how to accommodate their tactics to more traditional forms of political participation. And finally, social movements, while they can be associated with a number of formal organizations, are broader than any single organization. For instance, the women's movement is broader than NOW, the National Organization for Women. So all these characteristics of social movements contrast with the characteristics of interest groups. Interest groups tend to make greater use of inside political tactics, like lobbying, electioneering, and bargaining as means of achieving their goals. That's because interest groups are more focused on achieving specific government policy victories rather than broad-scale social change. Interest groups generally, although certainly not always, focus on material interests of their members. Interest groups also tend to be more professionalized in that they have expert staffs who do most of the work of trying to advance the group's policy goals. Most members of interest groups simply write checks to help fund the group's operations. They're not often called upon to take direct action. While social movements can tend to view political bargaining as potentially corrupting the purity of the movement's objectives, interest groups, on the other hand, have no compunction about negotiating to try to achieve a portion of what they seek. They see this as a consequence of having a seat at the table in shaping government decision-making. Finally, interest groups are clearly identifiable organizations. They're registered, and they tend to have boards of directors and paid staffs. Your reading this week from sociologist David S. Meyer on How Social Movements Matter does a good job of considering the ways in which movements make an impact on politics and society more broadly. It can be easy to look at almost any individual social movement and conclude that the movement failed to meet its objectives. This is because social movements often press for lofty ideals involving massive transformations in society that are extremely hard to achieve. But just because social movements tend to fail to reshape society in their preferred image, that does not mean that these movements fail to leave behind substantial and lasting change. To begin with, social movements can be very successful at raising an issue's salience. This means raising the profile of an issue so that more people pay attention to it. To use the terminology that we learned a few weeks ago in the policy theory module, salience corresponds to agenda setting, getting an issue on the radar of the public and decision makers. For instance, in recent years, the Black Lives Matter movement has been very successful at placing the issue of police killings of black men onto the public agenda. While the movement has yet to succeed in transforming policing in the United States, it has achieved a necessary first step in getting this issue debated and grappled with at local, state, and federal levels. A second impact social movements can have is in reframing an issue in a new light. We've seen this recently with the issue of global climate change. While this has been an issue high on the environmental policy agenda for many years, action has been slow, as the issue has been framed as one of scientific controversy and technical trade-offs between environmental and economic well-being. But recently, a social movement of young people, through organizations such as Youth for Climate and leaders like Greta Thunberg, have tried to reframe climate change as an issue of intergenerational morality, getting people to think about climate change in terms of the responsibility of current adults to leave behind a healthy Earth for the next generation. By raising an issue's salience and reframing issues in a new light, social movements can often bring pressure to bear on policymakers. For instance, the article by Professor Meyer describes how the anti-nuclear weapons movement of the 1950s and 60s helped pressure U.S. leaders to rethink nuclear proliferation and pursue arms control treaties with the Soviet Union. Another impact of social movements is that successful ones tend to gain institutional status. This means they are given some type of formal structure within government to pursue and protect the movement's objectives. For example, one impact the environmental movement had was to move Congress to create an environmental protection agency to carry out government policies to protect the environment. Similarly, one result of the civil rights movement was the creation of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission as part of the Civil Rights Act to enforce policies against workplace discrimination. Now, achieving this institutional status can often be difficult and controversial for social movements because many activists view this sort of accommodation within government as co-opting the movement's ideals and sapping energy from the movement. Finally, social movements are incredibly important engines of political activism in the country, training citizens in the ways and means of democratic participation. People who become involved in social movements build networks and come to see the ways in which their actions can have an impact. This can then translate to other issues as well. For this week's discussion board, I would like you to research and report on a social movement currently active in California. Hopefully you'll be able to identify one relatively quickly, as this state has a rich history of social movement activism and has been at the forefront of many prominent social movements, particularly over the last half century, as I've listed a number of them on this slide. I look forward to reading about the movements that you are most interested in.